Hey there! So today we talk about signatures of all 45 American presidents order-wise. Let's start the video with George Washington. George Washington, 1789 to 1797, a founding father, military general, and the first president of United States. President Washington called the dollar bill home and knew how to cross the Delaware River in style. John Adams became president in the year 1797 to 1801, the first vice president and soon thereafter the second president. President John Adams was the author of Massachusetts Constitution and by chance died on July 4, 1826, 50 years after the Declaration of Independence was adopted. Thomas Jefferson, 1801 to 1809. Growing up in Virginia, President Thomas Jefferson was co-author of the Declaration of Independence and in his spare time was enthusiastic by archaeology. Here is the signature of Thomas Jefferson. James Madison, 1809 to 1817. 5 feet 4 inches. President James Madison was the chief author of the Constitution, one of the two presidents to sign it, and he had a pet parrot named Polly. James Monroe, 1817 to 1825. Another president from Virginia. President James Monroe studied law under Thomas Jefferson and established the country's first foreign policy, known as the Monroe Doctrine. Here is his signature. John Quincy Adams, 1825 to 1829, gifted an alligator from Marquis de Lafayette. President John Quincy Adams was the first president to live in the White House. Here is the signature of John Quincy Adams. And next comes the Andrew Jackson, 1829 to 1837, the only president to be a prisoner of war. President Andrew Jackson has been on the $20 bill since 1928 and is known for founding the Democratic Party. Martin Van Buren, 1837 to 1841. President Van Buren was the first president to be born in US, had his daughter-in-law serve as First Lady after his wife passed, and had a gang formed in his honor. William Henry Harrison, 1841. With the shortest presidential term. President William Henry Harrison passed 1 month into his presidency from pneumonia that fell on him after standing in the rain for an hour giving his inauguration speech. John Tyler, 1841 to 1845, the first president to serve without being elected. President Tyler worked for the annexation of taxes to the United States and with a strong belief in state rights caused major rifts through all political parties. James K. Polk, 1845 to 1849. With a desire for expansion, President Polk set his eyes on the Pacific Ocean and extended the land of the US by 1.2 million square miles. Here is his signature. Zachary Taylor, 1849 to 1850. A hero of the Mexican-American War, he won the presidency because Northerners voted for him because of war heroism and Southerners did so because he was a fellow slave owner. Millard Fillmore, 1850 to 1853. The last of the Whigs, President Fillmore was all peace and smiles, trying to make everyone happy with the Compromise of 1850. Here is his signature. Franklin Pierce, 1853 to 1857. Some point their fingers at President Pierce for fueling the fire that started the Civil War. This is the signature of Franklin Pierce. James Buchanan, 1857 to 1861, the last president before the Civil War. President James served without a wife and had an eagle as a pet. Abraham Lincoln, 1861 to 1865, the tallest president, enshrined in the Wrestling Hall of Fame, and the man who issued the Emancipation Proclamation. President Lincoln led America during the Civil War and ironically signed legislation creating the Secret Service, hours becoming his assassination. Andrew Johnson, 1865 to 1869, known as the veto president for continually vetoing bills passed by Congress. President Johnson is one of 3 presidents to be impeached. Ulysses S. Grant, 1869 to 1877, a Union war hero. President Grant helped establish the national park system as well as pushing forward the 15th Amendment while fighting for the rights of Native Americans and African Americans. Rutherford B. Hayes, 1877 to 1881. President Rutherford did not serve alcohol at the White House and was the first to host the Easter egg roll, which continues today, and in his single term, dedicated his efforts to fighting to improve the government after the Civil War and protect the rights of people of all races. James A. Garfield, 1881, the second of 3 presidents to serve in 1881. President Garfield was shot 200 days into his term and died a few months later from complications, but not before he left his mark with efforts to end political corruption. Chester Arthur, 1881 to 1885, an unexpected leader by proxy. President Arthur helped to fund the Navy, which had been in decline, worked for funding for Native American education, reportedly had 80 pairs of pants, and held the nickname Elegant Arthur because of his desire to change outfits for every occasion. Grover Cleveland, 1885 to 1889, the only president to serve non-consecutive terms. President Grover Cleveland also shared the name of veto president and struggled to unite the country after the Panic of 1893. Benjamin Harrison, 1889 to 1893, grandson to the former President Harrison. This President Harrison welcomed Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Washington, Idaho, Wyoming to the US, while being the first president to live in the White House with electricity. William McKinley, 1897 to 1901, president through the Spanish-American War. President McKinley led the US as it assumed recognition as a world power while making significant efforts to rebuild the economy. Theodore Roosevelt, 1901 to 1909, known as the Trust Buster. President Roosevelt worked to make American life better for all, won a Nobel Peace Prize, and was the first president to leave the country while in office to visit the Panama Canal. William Howard Taft, 1909 to 1913. President Taft established a federal tax through the 16th Amendment, was the first president to reign over the contiguous 48 states, get stuck in a White House bathtub, and began the tradition of throwing out the first pitch at an MLB game. Woodrow Wilson, 1913 to 1921, in office during WW1 and winner of a Nobel Peace Prize for his work to form a League of Nations. President Wilson also was printed on the $100,000 bill. Warren G. Harding, 1921 to 1923, the first president to be elected after the 19th Amendment and owner of size 19 feet. President Harding's tenure was tainted by scandals caused by friends that he appointed to office. Calvin Coolidge, 1923 to 1929. President Coolidge signed the Indian Citizenship Act, which gave full US citizenship rights to all Native Americans in the midst of the Roaring Twenties, and is the only president to be born on Independence Day. Herbert Hoover, 1929 to 1933. Perhaps outshined by the Great Depression, President Hoover did sign the congressional resolution that made the Star-Spangled Banner the national anthem of the United States, was the first president to have a phone at his desk, and did not take a salary. Instead, he donated it to the charity. Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1933 to 1945. President Franklin brought America out of the Great Depression, led the US and Allied forces in WW2, and by the end of his fourth term, he laid the groundwork for the United Nations. Harry S. Truman, 1945 to 1953. Over two terms, President Truman dropped the atomic bombs on Japan, initiated the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine, and embarked on the Korean War. Dwight D. Eisenhower, 1953 to 1961. The commander and five-star general of the Allied force during WW2. President Eisenhower established the current interstate highway system, helped to negotiate an end to the Korean War, and created a permanent civil rights office in the Department of Justice. John F. Kennedy, 1961 to 1963. President Kennedy is credited for starting the Peace Corps, staying cool through the Cuban Missile Crisis, and with leaving the ongoing question of who was on the grassy knoll. Lyndon B. Johnson, 1963 to 1969. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Vietnam War were the main events during President Johnson's tenure. Richard Nixon, 1969 to 1974. Despite improving relations with the Soviet Union and China and the conclusion of the Vietnam War, President Nixon will be remembered primarily for Watergate scandal and his resignation, the only president to do so. Gerald Ford, 1974 to 1977, the only man to serve without being elected as either president or vice president. President Ford spent a great deal of his term mending the country's feelings towards its leaders while brokering a temporary truce in the Middle East. Jimmy Carter, 1977 to 1981. Gas prices skyrocketed with cars waiting in line to fill up while President Carter was in office, and during his time in office the Department of Energy and the Department of Education were created. Ronald Reagan, 1981 to 1989. From the Hollywood Hills to the White House, President Reagan battled through the Cold War, reasserted confidence in Americans, escaped an assassination attempt, and oversaw the events that led to the fall of the Berlin Wall. George Bush, 1989 to 1993. As the Soviet Union fell, the US led by President Bush began fighting in the Persian Gulf War, and he was also the third American president to be knighted by the Queen. Bill Clinton, 1993 to 2001, holding term during the longest period of peace and economic growth. President Clinton is also the second of three presidents to be impeached. George W. Bush, 2001 to 2009, in office during 9/11 and deciding to lead the US into Afghanistan and Iraq. President George W. Bush did overthrow Saddam Hussein. Barack Obama, 2009 to 2017, the first African American president. President Obama established healthcare reform, captured and killed Osama bin Laden, and kept the economy thriving through two terms. Donald Trump, 2017 and present. Donald John Trump, born in June 14, 1946, is the 45th and current President of the United States. Before entering politics, he was a businessman and television personality. Here is his signature. Thanks for watching.